Welcome everybody, good afternoon. Welcome to Leeds Beckett University's Planning School and to this virtual book launch. I'm the author of the book in question, and I don't know if you can see it here. That's what it exists in print. My name is Quentin Bradley. You're not going to hear very much from me this afternoon because I'm going to hand over now to our independent chair, who's the Professor of Urban Policy at Oxford Brookes University, Sue Brownill. So over to you, Sue.
Hi everybody, and thanks Quentin, and thanks for asking me to chair this session, and also thanks for writing the book. I really enjoyed reading it. I think it's really refreshing, filling a really big gap in debates about housing at the moment. So just to remind everybody, this session is being recorded. It's only the speakers we've got our cameras on, so anybody else attending isn't going to be recorded, but it does mean that it's going to be available for people online afterwards. So I'm going to be chairing the session. I'll just introduce the rest of the panel to you in the order in which they're going to be responding to Quentin's short discussion of the book, which will be following this part of the introduction. So really pleased to have on the panel Rosie Pearson, who's the chair and founder of the Community Planning Alliance, and Clare Symonds, who's chair and founder of Planning Democracy, Andy Inch, who's senior lecturer in urban studies and planning at University of Sheffield, and Mike Edwards, who's visiting professor at the Bartlett School of Planning and also a founder member of Just Space. So we've got a really interesting panel who I'm sure are going to raise some comments and questions and responses to the book. What we'd like you to do, if you do have questions, is to put them in the chat, and please also put comments in the chat as well. But if you've got a question, if you could put actually question at the beginning, because quite often, just so we don't miss them, I'm sure you're all going to have some really good questions, so just to make sure that they don't get lost in the comments. If you have a question, just put question first and then write the question afterwards, but please also put comments and any other feedback in the chat as well. So we're going to start off with Quentin giving a very short overview of the book, and then that's going to be followed by the panel in the order that I just introduced them, and then there'll be time for questions and answers and a discussion amongst all of you attending. So I'll hand it back to you, Quentin.
Thank you very much indeed, Sue. I don't want to say very much here, you know, I have a tendency to talk too much anyway. I just really want to say thank you to everybody who's helped contribute to this book, because it's based on several years really of working with and talking to amenity campaign groups, both the national campaign groups who are represented on the panel, and thanks very much to Clare and Rosie for joining us today, but also local campaign groups and amenity organisations and community associations going back to, and neighbourhood plans. And one thing that came across very strongly for me, and that is a major theme in the book, is that what we can call, I think, the amenity movement, I hope people feel part of a movement, even if they're not affiliated to any national organisations, that the amenity movement is campaigning for a democratic plan-led system that effectively regulates property development rights. And they champion the planning policies of amenity and environmental protection. And they advocate a fairer distribution of both the costs and the benefits of property development. And for me, that makes our contemporary amenity movement and all the campaign groups a continuation of the social movement, if you like, that created planning in this country and in other countries as well. We tend to see planning now as something that's a professional task. It's in the hands of local government and national government. We quite often see it as working for almost the real estate industry, but the planning system in this country was created by amenity organisations, by campaign groups. And we can see that very clearly in the fact that the CPRE, the Civic Trust and Civic Voice, the Open Spaces Society are still our national amenity groups, and were founded in the Open Spaces Society in the 1890s, CPRE and Civic Voice in the 1920s. They created the planning system we know today, and they created all the best planning policies. So they created the amenity policies, the urban containment policies of Greenbelt, and environmental protection. And what happens now, of course, is that the amenity movement is kind of lampooned as the organisation of homeowner property interests. And I was concerned in the book, to dismiss that argument because it has absolutely no foundation, but also to work with the idea that planning is about property rights, and planners almost never talk about property. They talk about space, they talk about land use, but nearly all land in this country is privately owned. And what planning is supposed to be doing is to regulate the rights of property owners to do what they want with their property, because what one property owner does with their land affects everybody else. So we can say that people have rights to property that they don't own because they have an interest in what other property owners do with their land. And yet those rights aren't really represented in the planning system at all. The only way they're represented is in the concept of public interest, and the only people who are allowed to adjudicate on the public interest are local authority and national government planners. And what we see now, I think, is that decades of the deregulation of planning and the exclusion of any organised collective public from planning has allowed property development really to be largely about land speculation. Everybody involved in that is united in driving up the price, the value of land. Well, one of the questions I wanted to examine in the book is, where does land value come from? Because we know it's created largely by things like public infrastructure, by transport, by location, by economic activity, but it's created by all the activity of a community that makes a place desirable, that makes a place livable. And we have a system where all the value of land is privately captured, if you like, and hardly any of it is distributed for any public good. And yet I think we can argue that communities have a right, both a right to a legitimate property interest in land they don't own, but also a right to the value of land. So in the book, I talk about the legitimate basis for amenity groups and their concerns over land use. And we can look to Scotland, where the community land law, community buyouts of land have enshrined the idea that communities have a right to the land on which their community is built, if you like, also to the rights of Indigenous peoples. Communities themselves articulate a concern for land, a stewardship for land. So I think what we can say is that the amenity movement in this country has a strong basis in property rights, that we can argue that communities have a right to an interest in the land on which their communities are built. They have a right to say what happens on that land. But more than that, that we need to return planning to prioritizing social and environmental goals. So to a large extent now, planning is about enabling the extraction of value from land, and land is no longer understood as place, as community, or as nature, as part of the environmental fragment of existence. So I've finished the book really with a kind of action plan for a planning system which actually is on the side of communities rather on the side of property development. I think all amenity groups have got a terrible experience of trying to participate in what should be a democratic service and finding themselves constantly excluded. But we have examples of democratic participatory decision making in planning. We need to build on that, but that's not going to get us anywhere until we actually solve the problem that private property has exclusive rights over what happens to land, and until communities themselves have their interest in property recognised. And much of the book is about trying to articulate a new, not new, but new to us now, ideas of property and land ownership and land use, and reuniting kind of the amenity movement with the agenda it was always advocating. So the amenity movement in this country invented the planning system in order to restore common rights, the community rights to land. And as I see it, today's contemporary amenity struggles are articulating a legitimate property interest in land, which the planning system should be championing. So that's all I really want to say, just to give you a taste of the book. It's an academic book, but hopefully it's very readable. But the price is a little bit academic, so I would get your library to your local library, if you still have one, to order it, and I hope you enjoy it and find it relevant. So I'm going to hand back now to Sue. Thanks very much, Sue.
Thanks, Quentin. Very good to summarise a book in 10 minutes or less. So, what I'm going to do now is ask each of the panel members just to provide a response, and then keep those questions coming in the chat. And we'll return to those after people have spoken. So, Rosie, I think you're starting.
I am, yes. Good afternoon, everyone. And I think Quentin's probably helpfully loading up some slides.
I'm just going to, sorry about that. I'm just going to stop that sharing and I can start a new one.
I can chatter while you do that happily. I mean, yeah, just to introduce, well, firstly, it's a real privilege to be here on this panel, and there's some great names of people, some of whom I'm familiar with from Twitter, so nice to see them. And to those of you who don't know me or the Community Planning Alliance, I now know, having read the book, that we are part of the amenity movement, and we set ourselves up a couple of years ago. And we wanted to try and see initially how many kind of amenity groups there were out there in the planning system. And we set up a blank map with a form people could fill in to self-select, put on the map. And within a couple of weeks, there were 200 groups on. We've now got 700 either individual campaigners or campaign groups mapped, and they are campaigning for everything, maybe against roads, it might be for the right type of homes, it might be against solar on greenfield, but for solar on rooftops, against incinerators, all sorts of things. Literally any kind of campaign in the planning movement you can think of, we've got represented on our map. And the three areas we're trying to focus on, well, we basically want to try and help support these groups, because campaigners like me at the beginning had never intended to become a campaigner, didn't know anything about the planning system or local politics. It was all new, learning from scratch. So what we're trying to do is level the playing field a bit and provide support for groups and a degree of training through webinars and so on and so forth. And we're also trying to lobby for change where we think we've got common issues. And so the three areas we're focusing on are community participation, better environmental protections, and the right things, whether that be housing, employment or infrastructure, in the right places. So next slide, please.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure that you could see it, so just go back a bit.
Thank you. So the photo there is in my garden, I can't remember, 4 or 5 years ago, when Quentin was, I think, asking on Twitter for examples of campaign groups to come and talk to for his research. So I hosted a little lunch here in Essex for 5 or 6 campaign groups, and Quentin came all the way down to meet us. And it was so nice because as Quentin said, it's a real battle, as many listening will know, to try and interact with the planning system as a community campaigner. And we were all, by the time we met him, we were really ground down locally with our various campaigns. None of our councils were listening to us. None of the developers we were trying to talk to were listening to us. You sometimes feel you're going a bit mad because you sort of make sensible suggestions and the planning system just kind of ignores them. So it was really nice because Quentin came and sat down and listened to us all rant for a couple of hours, took copious notes, and it was great to feel that actually we were potentially doing the right thing, as in campaigning for a plan-led system that actually delivered things that were good for everybody rather than the wrong thing, which might be what's proposed by the developers. So it's great to be able to talk about the book, Property, Planning and Protest, the Contentious Politics of Housing, because it was really interesting. I enjoyed reading it. I found it very accessible, and it gave a nice academic backdrop to all the campaigning we're doing. So I've got now the terminology that I can use, the academic terminology, to wave at people to make me sound a bit cleverer. So that's a good outcome. So next slide, please. So is planning contentious? Well, I mean, yes, anyone that's on Twitter will know it's extremely contentious. I did a really quick Google search for NIMBYism and found these various headlines. So New Statesman, NIMBYism, a miserly system of privileging one group over another. I myself was called the Queen of the NIMBYs by the Sunday Times. You've got solar power's NIMBY problem in The Economist. Then a really nice one by a journalist last week on Twitter. NIMBYs will be against all new tower blocks or housing developments. They are tenure blind. There could also be some class snobbery too. And then The Times, NIMBYs are the real reason your children cannot buy a house. So we, the amenity groups, rather than NIMBYs, who care deeply and passionately about our local areas, get quite a lot of flack from quite a lot of angles. So next slide, please. Therefore, when I read the book, it was an absolute delight to see that no research has ever demonstrated a connection between the defence of property values and opposition to development. And I like this little quote by, presumably pronounced, well, it might be Volsink, it might be Volsink, don't know, but this injurious name calling lacks any analytic content and has prejudicial caricatures. So I'm going to save that quote and wave that around on Twitter. And exactly as Quentin said in his introduction, yeah, we're championing a democratic plan-led system, and we want land use to address social need. We want it to protect the environment, and we want it to actually benefit communities rather than just benefit developers' pockets. Next slide, please. So I like the phrase commoning in the book, which I hadn't heard of before, and it's kind of broadly defined as a community planning movement asserting its right to be recognised, and the kind of the broader arena around property. So yes, we that live in an area do kind of have a right to the whole area, and sometimes you see that in kind of the street life of people kind of hanging out together in the streets, the litter picking that Quentin mentioned in the book, maybe someone that goes and mows the front lawn of the village hall, all that sort of thing. So people do feel they belong in an area, and therefore they rightly feel aggrieved or upset when something bad is proposed. And the book points out that landowners and developers are the ones who benefit from whatever they propose, and the nearby communities suffer the cost. That might be lost amenity land, that might be stress on infrastructure, it might be, I don't know, a view that's gone forever, all sorts of things, and we're all too familiar with that. So the whole amenity line provides a way of thinking about property that goes beyond the possession of possessive logic. So outside, literally, this person owns this land and he or she has the right to do what they want with it. And it says, which I agree with, that if you have property, you also have obligations, as well as just the right to do what you want with it. Next slide, please. So one feature of the book is this whole argument about need versus greed. And greed might be too strong in some cases because a developer just trying to make money from building homes, not necessarily greedy. But what you see in the whole planning system is a huge focus on housing demand, and that's what people might want. So you might want a bigger home, you might want to buy a holiday cottage, or you might want to invest in a buy-to-let. That's fine, nothing wrong with wanting to do that, but that is demand, and the planning system is very good at facilitating that. Housing need, on the other hand, which is a safe roof over your head, which is essential and very important, not just desirable, I think the planning system neglects that hugely, and the book does address that. So next slide, please. A demonstration of how the planning system isn't working is that we have more dwellings in England than households. And I won't look too much at the bottom line, the 2014 household projections. For those who are familiar with how the housing targets are set, government insists currently on using out-of-date projections, the 2014 ones. It used to be in guidance that the councils had to use the most up-to-date projections, but those most up-to-date projections don't get anywhere near to the 300,000 homes a year target that government wants to achieve. So they've kind of artificially kept the targets high by using the old projections, and population growth is slowing. So anyway, the point of this slide is, look, we have got more dwellings than households. It doesn't mean there's not a housing crisis. There is a housing crisis for people that can't afford to get onto the ladder in any shape or form, but there isn't a shortage of dwellings per se. Next slide, please. I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but the supply of housing now is only tangentially about the provision of homes. I'm quoting Quentin's words here because he's far more articulate than me, so better to do that. But it's all about the extraction of value through construction, and that leads to the destruction of the built and natural environment. We've got a really narrow focus nationally on housing targets, but those housing targets don't actually focus down on what the need is, and housing waiting lists and hidden households, or housing in people in temporary accommodation, that sort of thing. All that's neglected. And I remember being very shocked really at examination in public of our local plan, because our local authorities did a great strategic housing market assessment. So we all knew what the need was. It's great, good, one of the few good reports they did, if we're honest. But it never ever got alluded to, and the plan seemed to be produced in isolation without actually trying to deliver to meet any of the needs identified in that plan. So I found that very strange. But it all comes down to authorities being forced to allocate land to meet numbers, and that kind of drives everything, all the decisions, which is a great shame. Next slide, please. So this summarises, which even back in 1984, Cliff Haig, who I hadn't heard of before, but what I believe we're campaigning for as a campaign group: all people should be decently housed in safe and attractive environments, and you should have employment, public transport, cycling, walking, public space for all. It sounds totally common sense, doesn't it? And it's extraordinary how hard we find as a country to deliver these really fundamental things that you'd think should be basics and a given. Next slide, please. The book pointed out the past social housing successes, and that actually in the 1980s public housing was in surplus, that the older properties subsidised the new ones, they were generating more in rental income than the cost of debt repayment and maintenance, and they provided a surplus to Treasury of 45 billion over a 30-year period. So it's a no-brainer to me. Why would you not be building social housing if you can actually not only provide homes for people, but you can capture a surplus for Treasury? And then we're now with a system where much of our so-called affordable housing is actually discounted off market price. But the stat in the book, discounted homes fell from 40% to 17% in 5 years after the new viability system was adopted. So we're in a system that not only isn't delivering social housing, it's also not even delivering discounted housing as it should do. Next slide, please. This slide is probably a bit too much for you to glance at, but basically if you look at the red line is social housing, and you can see how it has dropped in the past. I can't read the graph because of the way the screen's set up, but it doesn't matter. Basically it shows how few social houses we're building, around about 6,000–7,000 a year or under, and how that's dropped, and that's shocking. It really is, because also we're losing houses through right to buy. So social housing really is an afterthought, and it should be the main thought. Next slide, please. I love the participatory democracy theme that Quentin outlined both today and in the book, and that's something we're absolutely passionate about, is that the public should be involved through debate, through direct democracy. Things like neighbourhood plans are obviously a really good representation of that. And I always bang on about, I can never remember where I first read it, but we really need to move to this ED, which is engage first, then deliberate, and then decide, instead of what happens, which is DAD, which is the council or a developer will decide first what's happening, then they will announce it, and then they will defend it to the hilt, and it's super contentious. You get judicial reviews, and it ends up with the planning system that we have at the moment. So I am convinced that if we move to the ED system, we'd have far better, far quicker plans, because everyone would be listened to from the beginning, but maybe that's naive. And then the book also highlights that, of course, this participatory democracy requires resources in a gapingly unequal society. And as I mentioned earlier, that's partly why the Community Planning Alliance is was set up, because of course you've got community groups with no resources up against, in a local plan, for example, rows of developers with their barristers, the councils with their barristers. They all have specialist teams and specialist consultants, and you're sitting there trying to be an expert in every single field, where you've got people who've devoted their entire career to their certain field. It's really unbalanced. So yeah, very in favour of participatory democracy. And I think that's my last slide. It is. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rosie. We're going to take questions at the end rather than for putting them to each person. So I'll ask Clare now to make her comments on the book. And do keep putting your questions. Sorry, Clare. Keep putting your questions in the chat. There's some great ones coming through already. We're going to get a really good discussion later.
Okay. Hi, my name is Clare Symonds and I'm from Planning Democracy. Thanks very much to Quentin for inviting us to speak today, and indeed for including us in your book, which I think is a very important book. I first got in touch with Quentin about 2 years ago when I discovered an article that he'd written on the financialisation of housing market through housing land supply. And well, you know how the time goes, and I was had to go back through my old emails to find out just when it was that I first made contact with Quentin. But when I read them, it really made me chuckle, actually, because I was so excited to find somebody that not only understood what we were trying to get our heads around, but was willing to help as well. So my emails are saying things like, look, he says this and he explains this and he justifies our concerns, and look, he uses this term, planning by surrender. I love that term, we must use it, you know, that sort of thing. So that was, you know, for me, the importance of people like Quentin and you know, books like this and articles, because they help you know, people who are trying to understand and get our heads around these complex topics, and it's really crucial for folk like me and Planning Democracy. Yeah, so who am I and what is Planning Democracy? I suppose we're a grassroots organisation, and we work exclusively in Scotland, and we've been going since 2009, and we work with individuals, communities, groups who are affected by or interested in planning. So we tend to work in 4 different ways: providing advice and solidarity to people, providing a peer mentoring support service, building community capacity and developing community-based activism, and carrying out advocacy and, if you like, political lobbying. But especially important to our community work are 3 elements. You could call them sort of values or approach, perhaps. The first is listening. The second is starting where people are at. And third is empathy and understanding. So a quick example of one of our situations was Jane, a retired nurse. She came to us having learnt about a housing application for 150 houses on the only piece of natural green space available to her and the residents of Ferny Hill, which is an area on the outskirts of Edinburgh that's currently subject to considerable development pressure. Interestingly, the play park next to Jane's house, which will be the only bit of open space available for her if these houses are approved, did in fact used to be 36 houses. That was before they all subsided into a limestone mine working in 2001, something that occupies Jane's mind somewhat. So Jane's email to me was, need help on how to object to this housing plan. I've done a petition, I've dropped leaflets, but I'm not technology savvy. I've got lots of elderly neighbours and I've got this far and now I'm stuck. I think I filled in the wrong box. Sorry. So despite previous issues with mine shafts, there have been actually a total of 6,000 houses, applications for 6,000 houses in the immediate area. But this one was really going to impact on Jane and her community, and finally she decided to do something. So we've now provided support for her for 2 years, which has included going to visit the site and finding ecologists to assess the site and giving her basic advice on sort of local democracy, really, how to work with elected members and her community council. Now, she had no idea who her community council was, and in fact some of you might not, because if you're English based, but they're basically a bit like a parish or a town council. They're sort of the lowest level of tier of democracy. They're a statutory body run by residents acting on behalf of their community, and they're also statutory consultees in planning. But Jane hadn't heard of any of them. In fact, when I suggested she got their help, her first action was to knock on the door of the community centre, asking the puzzled community gardener for his help, not realising that this was a completely different kind of community entity. But over the course of 2 years, she's had to respond to a planning application and, of course, the inevitable subsequent appeal. So our support has included explanations of development plans, national planning policies, how to work with the Department of Environment and Planning Appeals. And we've had to explain housing land supply arguments, although the complexities proved somewhat challenging. But in the end, her fourth response to this application, her second letter to the reporter, in England, I think you might call him an inspector, was one of the most powerful I've ever read. You know, she weaved her own situation and her local knowledge of the demography of the area, bus timetables, use of the land, into the necessary language of material considerations. And it was epic. It was truly epic and very powerful. Now, in your book, Quentin, you've used the term amenity groups and suggested that we're an organisation that coordinates and networks local amenity groups. So this is part of what we do, but clearly it's not all that we do. So much of our support is about listening and assessing the appropriate level of support, whilst providing empathy and kindness that the system doesn't offer for people who are forced into engaging with it. And for me, that is grassroots work, working with the people in their context, where they're at. Now, years ago, I described this approach to a planner. He responded he doesn't have time for the touchy-feely stuff. And he's right, you know. The system doesn't accommodate such niceties. He couldn't put that in his planning performance report, could he? But this mindset is merely speaking the language of economics, the overriding language of public life. Quentin, in your book, you say the characterisation of amenity groups as defenders of property values was concocted because that is the way households are expected to behave in the idealised simulations of neoclassical economics. And I think it's so important that we challenge the 21st century depiction of humans as rational, economic, self-interested, independent individuals who are dominant over nature. The truth is, we are cooperative, we're social, we're flawed, sometimes vulnerable, and totally interdependent with nature. And we need to be treated as such. And you suggest quite rightly that the amenity groups participating in land use decisions are characterised as unrepresentative because of their socio-economic advantage. You say their concerns for real estate developments is greeted with derogatory jeers and venomous acronyms. And like with Rosie, you know, this very much chimes with us as well. And long have we railed against the term NIMBY as well, Rosie, which has been used to dismiss and delegitimise us. However, it is by uniting with groups, for example, groups looking to address the lack of affordable homes in rural Scotland, members of Living Rent, marginalised groups struggling to be heard, that perhaps we'll be in a stronger position to challenge this narrative and those jeers. You also quote Cliff Haig, so I'm mentioning Cliff Haig as well, who we actually know quite well because he lives up here. But in an unequal society, participation will itself be an unequal exercise. And so moves towards participation and greater equality need to proceed together. Now, early on in our work, I conducted interviews with different people affected by planning, and two interviews really struck me. One was with an unemployed dyslexic community gardener from Edinburgh's most deprived community in Muirhouse. She was working to protect some potential growing space from a big housing development, and has indeed done so very well. It's now a thriving community garden. And the other was a highly educated, well-connected professor who also ran up against the planning system while protecting a UNESCO World Heritage Site from development, also successfully. But both had suffered mental health breakdown, which their experiences of planning had significantly contributed to. Now, planning democracy is particularly interested in this because the cost of planning to businesses is much debated and indeed much made of by the house builders. But the health and psychological cost to members of the public trying to get their voices heard is barely acknowledged. And what was interesting was that both of my interviewees used the same language, expressed the same experience and impact of a system that doesn't stop, listen, respond and care. So despite the differences of influence and education between them, both had struggled with the same problem. So from this, I take some solace that even if we don't have time as a small organisation to do the outreach and to actively assist people at the margins of society, at least by improving the system and creating a better democracy, increasing transparency and creating a space for issues to be debated, this in general will help everybody. And Quentin, you talk about monopoly power and how housing becomes almost a side effect of a financialised housing regime, with a focus on making money over providing shelter and quality places. But despite the lobbying power and the seemingly ubiquitousness of the likes of Homes for Scotland, who are the representative body for the volume house builders up here, and the apparent regulatory capture of all things planning, I think there are opportunities for change, but we need to push hard and we need to push together. We really came up against this monopoly power, particularly during the planning reforms here in Scotland in 2014 to 19. It's resulted in a new and thoroughly unnecessary planning act. But the evidence was that the house builders were the ones who lobbied for further change and triggered the reforms, which ultimately resulted in losing supplementary planning guidance, regional plans, and placing the emphasis away from real community rights to toothless local place planning, our equivalent of neighbourhood planning. Perhaps what they didn't reckon on us getting was a purpose for planning incorporated, which requires plans to be in the long-term public interest. This term public interest is seen by many policymakers to be synonymous with economic growth. As long as development delivers economic gains, it's in the public interest. But perhaps this is our opportunity up here to bring forward a broader meaning to public interest and to capture this term for ourselves. Talking of capture, land value capture is also on the agenda up here. Unusually and necessarily, it's receiving support from all political parties. But I guess it also needs support from the whole of the UK too. However, despite being mentioned in the planning reforms, and again in the more recent land reform bill up here, there's nothing concrete happening. It's been kicked like a can down the road. So Quentin, as with our work together on understanding how the technicalities of housing land supply calculations and how these policies are being exploited by the house builders, the collaboration with you has been really helpful and leading us to a little bit of success with the National Planning Framework for housing policies. So I think it's really important that we work together to understand more about land value capture. As you have so eloquently said in your book, the retreat from community land value capture and the return to landowners of their property rights has left housing a fetishized commodity, like that. The benefits of its development inequitably shared and the costs unfairly imposed on public services and local communities. So I think that redistributing the costs and benefits of development has the potential to play a really significant role in promoting social and environmental justice. And it really strikes at the heart of tackling the problem of the financialisation of housing. So we need to increase people's understanding of the financialisation of housing. Now, your book is academic in nature, although far more accessible than many. But the challenge for us is to make it relevant and real to people like Jane, so that they can join with us to bring about the changes we need. And I'm sure there will be opportunities for us to do that. And I've got a few ideas in mind. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak.
Thank you, Claire. And we might come back to you to talk about those ideas in a little while as well. But I'll hand over to Mike now.
Okay, just switching on my microphone. Hello everybody, and it's very good to be here. I've got 3 or 4 points I really want to make. I'm stimulated by this tremendously good book. I really have enjoyed reading it, and I think quite a bit of it I shall need to read again because it's quite dense and there's an enormous amount of material embedded in there. In a way, the thing that appeals to me most about this book is the way in which it knits together some quite rarefied debates about rent and land and theories of land and theories of rent, which we find quite challenging in universities, quite difficult stuff, but manages to knit it together with the specific history of land and land use and planning and housing in England and elsewhere in a way which makes it much more comprehensible. And I mean, that's very rare to find, and it's extremely valuable, I think, and I'm really, really pleased to have it. So that's my first main sort of point. I guess it's for all of us to think of ways to convert this text or persuade Quentin to produce extracts or versions of it which are short and more suitable for widespread circulation amongst activists and so on. But that will come, I'm sure, and it's extremely valuable to have it. In particular, clearly at the moment, it's useful material in the constant battle of debunking and discrediting the supply side economics of the think tanks, and getting beyond this awful debate between a kind of stereotyped NIMBY and stereotyped YIMBY kind of polarization of the discussion, which I think this book kind of punctures that balloon very well. It really shows that up as a kind of tremendously distracting and dangerous perspective. So that's good. Thinking of it from a London perspective, I've got a couple of things that I suppose I'm less enthusiastic about because there's so much more work to be done to apply this way of thinking to our specific conditions in London. One of them is that, in a way, the problems that we have in London of inequality and appalling housing conditions are so much due to this whole pursuit of agglomeration economies in the business sector by the real estate and financial industries, constantly talking about how wonderful is the agglomeration of activity, of business activity in great cities, making London's economy, you know, the engine of the nation, the source of all growth in the British economy. That whole perspective, and that's a particular aspect of this rent theory and alternative economics, which we've got to do more work on, I think. The second thing I wanted to raise, and maybe this is something we should discuss, it looks as though people in the chat are interested in this issue too, is about the amenity societies. I mean, Quentin in the book has taken a very broad sense of amenity movements spanning everything from the TCPA to CPRE through the local amenity societies all over England. In the London perspective, we find really that the activist groups which are more representative of working class and low income people are really rather separate from the amenity societies organised in the London Forum of Amenity and Civic Societies. We actually cooperate with them very well. We being in this case Just Space is a network of more grassroots, more kind of working class based campaigns. We cooperate quite well with them, but we very definitely regard ourselves as representing different segments of the social interest. The amenity societies in London tend to be very middle class people in general. I mean, this is a generalization, but predominantly so. And know it and admit it, and you know that they're not trying to hide that or pretend it, and they're enormously valuable and do tremendously good work on all kinds of issues. But there are a lot of groups in London who don't have a voice in that kind of milieu, and for which other kinds of channels of communication and forms of organisation seem to be needed at the moment. I don't think this is an enormous problem, because all of us, I think everybody in this meeting today, and certainly all the people on the panel, we're very used to working through alliances and through coalitions with people we don't completely agree with, but coalitions where we can find some common ground on particular issues to unite on. So that's not a problem. So that, I think, is the main things I wanted to put into the discussion. Two other quick points. The first is that a very rewarding thread in this book, I think, is what has been done to the work of environmental professions by this move from a environmentally oriented, a socially oriented public interest to a wholly commodified neoliberal kind of world. The way that has constrained and distorted and damaged the profession of planning in particular. And a similar argument, I think, could and should be extended to architecture and indeed other professions. So that's an important area of work that I hope people will continue to do. I mean, I've been working a bit lately with a very nice man, a film producer called Tom Cordell, whose film Utopia London you may have seen, about London social housing, and he's working very much on trying to find cinematic ways of portraying the death of the old welfare state and the emergence of these much more commodified relationships and displacing the old sensibilities of the more democratic period. So I think there's need for people in the theatre, in poetry and filmmaking and television to take this book of Quintin's and quarry it for good material. I think I'll stop at that point, but I'm going to put in the chat a link to the pandemic recovery plan, which community groups in London made during the lockdown, which people may find useful as another kind of expression of what citizens groups can do, being positive, being creative, not just responding to public bodies, but taking initiatives. So I'll put that in the chat in a minute. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. Very thought-provoking comments and reflections. I'm sure again we'll return to those in the discussion. And finally, Andy, and thanks to everybody who's putting comments and questions. Keep them coming, and we'll return to them after Andy's spoken.
Thanks, Sue. Can you hear me okay? I'm having some trouble with my camera, so I can't see myself or anyone else. So just to check that the audio is working all right.
Yeah, we can hear you fine, and I can see you.
Okay, it must just be at my end. Maybe it's just as well I'm not looking at myself. So thanks very much, and thanks to Quintin for the invitation, and congratulations on the book, which I'll say a little bit about in a second. Thanks also to Rosie, Claire and Michael too for some really thought-provoking and interesting comments. I guess, yeah, these are questions that the themes that the book tackles are themes that I've been interested in for a long time, both through research work at the University of Sheffield and also through moonlighting a bit, helping out Clare with planning democracy over the years as well. So it's been really interesting to reflect on that, and also some current research, which I'll say a little bit about in a second. It's been really interesting to reflect on all of that whilst partially, but not entirely reading the book yet, Quintin, whilst on holiday the last few days. I've been enjoying it a great deal, and I think, as Mike and others have said, it really is sort of very accessible kind of read, given the complexity of some of the themes that you're tackling and the importance of the argument. I think, as Sue mentioned, I think it's really timely because I think it's a very important moment for us to be trying to rethink what we might think of as the planning movement and the politics of the planning movement at present. So actually the things that I want to say are probably things that have been largely covered by others. So I'll try and say a few things and add a bit here and there whilst I can, and then keep it short so that we've got lots of time for questions. There's kind of three broad points that I wanted to make. The first was really to echo Michael about how good it is to see you kind of centering the political economy of land, rent, housing, property and planning in all of this. I think it's really, really important at the moment. And that sort of project of making sense of the kind of pervasive influence of the real estate and finance industrial complex and their impacts on spatial development, but also on planning and the cultures of the ways that we regulate development are hugely important. What Bob Colnett, I think is on the call, calls the property lobby has certainly grown in size and political influence. If we think of the centrality of land and property to the whole of the UK economy now, it's probably greater than it's been at any point in history, and really dominates as a result the politics of planning. So I really enjoyed reading the ways that you weave that in and make sense of some sort of long-standing and complex debates that really need to be revisited at the moment. So that was really welcome, I think. I think another thing that you pick up and make do a really nice job of explaining, Quintin, is the way that all this boils down into planning, such that we come to think of kind of market-defined development as being fundamentally in the public interest, which I think is a really important point that I've kind of worked through and explored and puzzled about myself over time. I think we kind of end up in this position where the property lobby and the planning project as a professional project, as Michael described it, have kind of increasingly fused, and that's been going on for a long time. Recently, I was rereading a book from 1987 by Eric Reed on British town and country planning that talked about the kind of corporatist bargain between the property lobbies and the planning profession. And I think, if anything, though, it's clearly intensified over time and really entrenching kind of a sense of the fundamental imperatives of commercial logics and kind of capitalist realism of contemporary development, but by which I mean just the idea that there is no alternative to market determined ways of distributing goods, of making decisions, and of developing. So I think it's really important that and I think the book makes an important contribution to doing this, that we try to re-separate out, if you like, the property lobby from a planning movement and try and define what a planning movement is that's distinct from that property lobby. I think you can see the kind of pervasive and perverse impacts of this kind of fusing, this kind of corporatist fusing of property and planning interests in planning practices and in the way that the profession thinks about itself increasingly. The kind of cultures of professional planning, which is something that we looked into recently in a ESRC funded project called Working in the Public Interest. And there we spoke to a lot of planners about their practices and how they feel that they work in the public interest, how they feel their work contributes to the public interest. And for a great many of them, I think they've become very kind of acculturated to this idea that development itself is in the public interest, and particularly around housing. So housing is, given shortages of housing as the root cause of a housing crisis, we need more housing. Ergo, if I'm giving planning permissions or enabling planning permissions for more housing, I'm working in the public interest. And so you get at times kind of straining credibility. You get planners championing 4-bed executive housing estates on car-dependent sites and leafy green fields, and arguing that this is kind of a way of dealing with problems of homelessness and acute housing need. And I think you can only argue that through a fairly convoluted logic, really. And the idea that that's become a kind of part of the common sense of the way that the planning profession thinks about development and thinks about its role is deeply worrying to me. So I think there's something there that the book does a very good job of helping to unpick and to question, which is really important, and to sort of question the extent to which planning is acquiesced to kind of market defined outcomes, and the ability to kind of distribute a minimum amount of affordable housing on the back of the profits being made from land, and it's not really good enough. I guess most worryingly of all, but maybe also in terms of opening up opportunities on the back of that, is that there's kind of a growth fetish at the heart of this, isn't there? That we can continue to develop and to grow, and we can continue to drop houses wherever we want without costs. And in an age of climate emergency, in an age of nature emergency, where the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in Europe as well, these kind of logics no longer really hold and need to be quite fundamentally questioned, I think, which potentially opens up, I suspect, kind of political avenues for challenging and questioning an over-reliance on kind of speculative profit-seeking development as a means of achieving socially required outcomes. And the book does a nice job, I think, of beginning to parse that really sort of tricky and often conflated distinction between need and demand, and getting to grips with that and getting to the bottom of that is surely at the heart of any attempt to get underneath these issues. I think alongside that kind of acquiescence, that kind of a common sense that development is in the public interest, that's what creates the sort of challenges that Rosie and Clare spoke about as well, and sort of thought through this over time with Clare and Planning Democracy, that you're seen in objecting to, in opposing the development, you immediately stand on the wrong side of the dominant common sense, and that's where all that name calling that you highlight in the book, Quentin, the idea that anybody who objects is necessarily a NIMBY, and their view can therefore be dismissed. You don't have to take seriously the substantive concerns that people might be raising. That all of that comes in on the back of that. So challenging and tackling that kind of culture, that common sense, is a big part also of overturning it and reworking that, and beginning to place kind of the public good and a reworked notion of the public good and public interest back at the heart of planning. Moving on from that, though, I think that taking on the characterization of these movements as regressive in opposing development, as NIMBYs and therefore objection is really important, and is a core contribution. But I had some of the similar kind of concerns that Michael raised, perhaps in relation to kind of the broad definition of amenity groups in the book. And I guess there's this is a fairly heterogeneous kind of set of mobilizations and movements against development in different places. And I guess we have to be careful in kind of parsing the politics of different forms of mobilization. We've seen recently with the kind of populist mobilizations against the idea of the 15-minute city, for example, that not all kind of citizen-led participatory movements and mobilizations are politically, far from all, are politically progressive. In some work that Sue and I are involved in on the histories of community-led planning at the moment, it's striking that through the 1970s and 1980s, there's often a very stark distinction drawn between kind of more radical, more left-leaning community action type movements, and then the kind of perhaps more middle class, less politically radical, amenity-based movements, conservation-based movements. And this is often kind of runs through a lot of the literature from these periods. And so I think it's an interesting move to think about how we collapse that. And Michael spoke about this as well in terms of alliances and coalitions. And I think that's key here. How do you build those coalitions across and between potentially quite different interests, quite different class-based interests, quite different movements with quite different concerns. And I think there's probably been for a long time a suspicion of some of the kind of amenity movements that we're talking about, not just amongst neoclassical economists, beloved of the kind of home voter thesis that you talk about in the book, Quentin, but also in the organised left as well. People like Mike Davis talk about the homeowners Soviets of California and the ways that they pick up pitchforks to defend their turf in quite regressive ways. So I think we need to think seriously about that. We have to ask quite serious questions about the kind of organising and coalition building that's required, about the politics of these movements and how we can understand them, and how to build those coalitions and find the areas of commonality that can build coalitions to kind of build alternatives and to construct real alternative political movements. Claire mentioned work she's doing with Living Rent in Scotland, which I think is an interesting kind of example of a coalition like that, bringing together different movements to try and kind of to try and build solidarities. So, sorry, I'm just checking my notes. I guess there's maybe sort of long been a kind of a distinction between some of the more radical movements, which have been based on kind of organising for housing and for housing rights and housing justice, as opposed to the kind of amenity-based social movements who seem to campaign for the already well-housed, for example. And so constructing those coalitions is really important. I guess the test of this as a progressive politics would be kind of exactly what the solutions that are being advocated for are, and by who. So how to build coalitions that are orientated towards many of the things that Quentin talks about in the book, around decommodifying land and housing, rebuilding commons, reshaping dominant understandings of property, redistributing land values on the basis of a very different set of values orientated towards kind of care for people and the planet over profit, and organised to meeting people's needs so that everybody has access to decent and affordable housing, at the same time as democratising land and property development. These are all kind of maybe slogans, but I think they point to the possibility and the ways in which everybody so far on the panel has used versions of this kind of language, and his interest in this kind of language points towards the possibility of building alternatives constructed in and around these kind of demands. But I think it's important that there is a kind of set of demands, at least from where I stand, and in relation to the kind of movements I would like to see emerge and how I would like to understand the planning movement as a politically and socially progressive movement, and environmentally progressive movement. One final point then before I finish would be to reflect a little bit on what it takes to movement build in and through these kind of mobilizations and what Quentin broadly describes as the amenity movement. And I think here there's maybe some lessons, and Sue might be able to say more about this than I can, from kind of some of the struggles over time actually to institutionalize gains and to find institutional basis for this kind of politics. Certainly, I think that one of the overarching stories of the community action movement in the 1970s and 1980s is the difficulty of finding an institutional home, an institutional basis from which to draw and from which to forge this politics. It tends to take place in highly localized ways, doesn't it? Highly localized movements like those that Claire and Rosie have talked about. They spring up, they're very, very intense, and make really significant demands of people who get burnt out, worn out, and then kind of want nothing more than to get back to the rest of their ordinary life. So how do you build kind of real and lasting coalitions and real and lasting political movements? I think over time we've seen a number of different types of organisation move in and through that kind of conflict planning, dispute space. The environmental NGOs, for example, in the 1990s were very prevalent, very visible in that space. And I think if you read people like Christopher Roots reflecting on that, an academic who was involved and now does a lot of work on environmental politics, they after a certain time decided it was just too difficult to organise this stuff and organise in and around movements in and around this stuff. I think if we look politically, trying to think where the basis of political support for this stuff in terms of party politics, it's also difficult at the moment. If we look in Scotland, Claire talked about how hard it was to get these kind of concerns on the agenda of the planning reforms that were undertaken by a Scottish National Party government. If we look in England, I think, at times Conservatives have been open to certain kinds of amenity interest amenity interests, but I wouldn't say they're open to the kinds of more radical reorganisation and redistributive politics that I've and others I think are talking about. The Labour Party recently, we've been involved in trying to, a little bit on the edges of trying to see what they think around this stuff, and they seem to have been captured quite significantly, I would argue, by certainly nationally in relation to housing, by YIMBY interests who believe that the kind of allowing the market to do its thing is the best way to meet housing need, which is clearly not what we would be looking for. So I think there's some real question marks around where and how to build this movement, where and how to build its politics, and how to find a political home for this kind of politics. So I'll leave it there, because hopefully that opens up some further questions for people. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks to everybody on the panel. We're quarter of an hour ahead of time, so that's great that everybody has kept to time. So I've been tasked with putting the questions to the panel. I'm just going to go through these in order on the chat, and actually it's really good because the first one relates very much to that thread about amenity groups that Mike started and Andy's picked up on. So this is a question from Solmaz. I hope I pronounced your name right. Do you think campaign groups are also inclusive in terms of race, etc.? Is the question. And I think it touches again on this issue about broad organisations, amenity groups, need for alliances. I don't know if anybody's got any thoughts on that.
I think you might have to direct it to a particular person.
Shall I? I'll start. Fine.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can make one or two comments on that. From our experience in the Just Space network in London, which is more diverse and more inclusive than many groups are, but still not representative of London's ethnic mix in proportions. And it's perfectly easy to sort of understand the forces which bring that about. But I think one thing that Just Space has done is to try very hard to ensure that groups in the population who are relatively powerless in public debate and so on get as much voice and as much space as possible. And you can see a really good example of that last autumn we persuaded the London Assembly, which is a kind of semi-parliament consultative kind of scrutiny body in London. We persuaded the London Assembly's planning committee to allocate a whole meeting for a presentation of this Just Space recovery plan for London. And we put up 6 speakers to present it, people who contributed to the recovery plan. And I think out of those 6, 4 are non-white. A different 4 are women. You know, so that was a fairly good kind of mixture. And in a way, what was interesting, I think, is that some of those voices, when asked to speak about planning and planning for London, paid absolutely no respect to the statutory definition of planning. So they were talking about transport issues, welfare benefit issues, the way in which local government works, the way in which access to the internet is regulated and policed, everything about transport and transport fares, all of which fall outside the scope and responsibilities of the town and country planning system, and therefore outside the scope of the planning committee of the London Assembly. And the poor old Assembly members, you could see, were kind of stumbling around trying to make this link with their policy areas in their plan. And of course they couldn't. And in a way that made me think, and I think made a lot of us think, well, it is really important in diversifying in these debates to diversify the subject matter as well. So it is not just a matter of affordable housing percentages and density matrices and other kind of town and country planning technicalities, but really does cover the whole of human life. That's what is important. That's what people experience. The oppressions people experience don't respect administrative boundaries. So I think that is part of it. That's not the whole story, but that is part of it, I think.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mike. Claire.
Hi, thanks so much for that. Are you getting feedback from me? Not sure why that's happening.
People turn mics off? Yeah, great, thanks.
I thought that was a really good question. You really set me thinking, actually, when I read that question. So thanks for that. And I think Andy did provide a really good answer to it in many respects around forming coalitions and so on, because that's a good way to sort of bring about greater pollination, if you like, and open people's eyes and to other people's issues. But I think it's very difficult to, say whether or not community groups are, open to and how open we are to different groups of people, because it's a bit of a blanket term, isn't it? And there are many and varied, as Andy suggested. You've got the more populist groups emerging at the moment, and but there are some really good left-leaning and inclusive ones as well. So but I think what's important is two things. One is that we try to create spaces for more debate, and we've recently had some citizens' assemblies up here, and I've been to a couple of them, and I thought they were really good spaces for debate and making people listen, getting people off Twitter and actually talking to each other. So I think lobbying for more participatory democracy can only sort of help us to understand and listen to other people from different walks of life and so on. But I also think that although I'm not a great fan in many respects of local place plans or your neighbourhood plans down in England, partly up here at least, which is my experience, is I feel that they're a little bit toothless. There's no opportunities for them to be adopted into the local development plan, so they could be a wasted opportunity for people, or wasted energy, but they are an opportunity for people to talk to each other from their local communities and be as inclusive as possible, and the fact that they need to demonstrate that they have done that, I think it can only be a good thing. So yeah, two opportunities there, I think, for ensuring that we do get more inclusive community working.
And Rosie as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well, because the question is, maybe is your group representative of whatever area it's representing? So for example, where I live in East Anglia, it is very white. We've got a pylons campaign across the whole of East Anglia. It's probably a very white campaign just by the nature of the demographics, and actually because it's a very rural area, again, the demographics are probably quite high in terms of age. So so I think there's that point, is kind of what community area are you in, and then there's whether your group can represent other groups even if they're not fully participating. So a previous campaign, the one that Quentin came to talk about actually with the new towns, we knew from our petitioning that we did door to door that people were saying, we haven't got the time or the bandwidth or the energy to support you, but we do, and we really appreciate we do. And that was people from all walks of life, all demographics. So kind of that was, we were kind of representing them because they were unable to represent themselves. So So I think there's that. And then final thing, citizens' assemblies, I think is a brilliant idea. And funny enough, I was wondering whether we should ask all our local election candidates for May the 4th or whatever it is, whether they all pledge for a citizens' assembly next time the plan review comes around. But I thought, what's the point of asking them, because they'll all pledge yes and then they won't necessarily do it anyway. So I'm not going to ask them, but it would be amazing, wouldn't it? So yeah, that's my point.
Thanks. Andrew, do you have anything to add?
Not a huge amount. I think it'd be it's a very, very important question, and it will be very, very varied. But the overall answer is probably that over time, community-based planning groups haven't been representative in that sense, and the diversity hasn't been all that it could and should be. And there's a lot of probably hidden stories and other things there. That, but also, yeah. So I think that's a really important thing to think through and work through.
Yeah, I think just to say, this research that Andy and I have been involved in, looking at the history of community-led planning, that is something that we're definitely finding, that a lot of voices are not necessarily included, and women, ethnic minorities, black people. But I think the other thing is, and I think that goes back to what Andy was saying as well, about the resources and where the sort of funding for these networks. It's about alliances, but it's also about networks and funding and enabling people to get involved in that, sharing information, providing spaces, physical and virtual, and the way that has shrunk over the years, and has also been very much tailored towards certain types of planning outcomes as well. For example, in England, a lot of the money goes towards neighbourhood planning, whereas it used to go broader. So I think there's an issue there as well about that long-term putting in the infrastructure for alternatives to develop, basically, in terms of networks, in terms of supporting people.
Can I just quickly throw something into as well, which is a thought about property rights, given that's the frame that Quentin thinks about in the book, is the extent to which a lot of these movements are also, and a lot of mobilisations around planning, involve people who have their own property stake and are property owners in some sense. And those who aren't are maybe also disproportionately underrepresented. And whether rethinking property and people's relations to place and the nature of kind of more common and collective property claims to place might be one way of expanding engagement and participation and inclusion.
Can I add a point on that? Exactly that point, that a point that's been made very strongly in the London case recently is that the growth of private renting in the housing stock has made a large population, a third to a half of the population in many areas, so mobile because they're constantly having to leave their rented flat and move to another one, and they're in a different ward or a different borough. They don't get on the voting register. They hardly have time to get to know their neighbourhood before their lease is expired and they're off to the next one. And that this tends to disenfranchise an awful lot of people simply by virtue of being stuck in the private rented sector. And, you know, this is a new, relatively new kind of bias introduced into neighbourhood politics. Seemed to me quite an interesting point.
Thanks, Mike. Quentin.
Hello there. Yes. Oh, sorry. Mike, do you want to put your microphone off? Thanks. Everyone will know, I think, that one of the kind of ways that the amenity movement is criticised and attacked is on the grounds of whether it's representative or not, and that's constantly repeated that it's only a very small number of people who get involved in community consultation, in planning, and that they're all homeowners. And I think it's the speakers have kind of put the fingers on all these points here, but one of the kind of key concerns is that, first of all, planning itself is a tough subject to get people excited about, because as Michael said, it goes out of its way to make itself irrelevant to most people. And its kind of core idea of what is a material condition in planning is extraordinarily tightly defined and completely irrelevant to most of the things that actually come up and hit us in the face in everyday life. And I think that's the key, that's the first stone that we have to kind of turn over, because planning, as I said, it's about the land that we encounter in everyday life, and it's largely about land use. Now, land use is not just changing land use, which is how planning defines it in terms of development, is improving land and improving its value and changing its use. Well, land use is actually the current use of land, and what is the best use of land? And that is a question that everybody is encountered with. So if your concern is about dog shit on the pavement, that's land use. If it's about, you know, derelict sites, or if it's about, you know, just a landscape of industrial sheds or motorways, that's land use. And that's how our job is, to bring planning back from this kind of very professionalized, very siloed field that it's in, and make it relevant to people. And that's a tough nut to crack. The second thing is that being representative is an action. You know, you go out of your way to represent people, and that's what you know, the groups that Rosie and Clare are representing do. They knock on doors, they go around with petitions, they tell people about planning applications, they then monitor planning applications and planning developments, and they're all the time acting to try and represent people. But they're building a lobby of interest around place, if you like. So they're saying to people, what we have in common is that we all share this place, and we all have an interest in what happens to the land, you know, of this place. And as I think Michael said, and Andy's pointed out, that's quite contrary to all the messages we're getting and all the kind of economic signals in the market. And as Michael said, people are moving around far more in terms of lack of security of tenure. So it's an uphill struggle to say, I'm asking you to prioritize your concerns about place over your concerns about other things. I'd say finally that I think we have this tendency to divide movements. It's very important to be aware and to critique lack of inclusion. But the important thing is to create a bedrock of democracy where we can have open debates and deliberate, and where those conflicts can be brought out and explored. So rather than excluding people on the grounds that of their socioeconomic kind of status or whatever, or because they're homeowners, or making distinctions between a movement on the grounds of economic status, what we need to do is, as I think the speakers said, is to build those alliances, but to build them around an inclusive participatory democracy, where everybody, including the major real estate interests, the consultants, the house building companies, the property investment companies, the pension funds, the insurance companies, all have to use the same forum and debate on equal terms. I've worked in participation for most of my life. It angers me that, you know, democratic participation is constantly kind of lampooned by this idea it's colonized by the most affluent who are excluding the marginalized voices. I worked in social housing, so my experience of participation are the most disadvantaged communities in this country, and I firmly believe that, you know, participation in planning is the first step, and building that kind of equality around a movement rather than trying to kind of point out its divisions is the first step in changing planning in this country. So thanks very much for that.
Thanks, Quentin. I think we'll all agree with a lot of what you said there. Looking at the questions, we seem to have a group around neighbourhood planning and then a group around planning in itself. So I'll ask the next question, which is relating to neighbourhood planning, and then I might jump down because there's some more about neighbourhood planning further down the list. But this one is from Barbara, and she's asking, given the constraints of law and national and local policy, is doing a neighbourhood plan a waste of time? I think I'll put that to Rosie first.
Well, it's such a tricky question, this one, isn't it? Because you hear so many times where a neighbourhood plan stands for nothing, or that something else supersedes it. Or there was one round here where no one had advised the neighbourhood plan group that if they didn't specify what they wanted outside the settlement boundary, then essentially the plan was silent, and therefore a developer waltzed in and put a proposal in just outside the settlement boundary. So what they needed to have done is said, I don't know, for example, we will not accept development outside the settlement boundary, then they'd have been covered. So there's so many caveats to the neighbourhood plan, but I'm a very firm believer in them. I think it's an amazing way of bringing communities together, to understand planning, to get people to understand their area and what they want to see for it. They do have benefits. They enable people to understand better how to negotiate with the council. So I think personally, yes, always worth doing, with caveats. That's my personal view.
Thanks. Claire, do you want to? I heard you say something. You placed, and it may be interesting to talk a bit more about the place plans in. Is it place plans in Scotland? It's place plans in Wales, I know, but it might be interesting to kind of talk about that as well. But be interesting to hear your views too.
Yes, they're called local place plans up here, and I think some of the differences is that we don't have to have a referendum on ours. I think you do down in England. So I think they're slightly lighter touch perhaps, but they remain out with the sort of statutory plan, the statutory development plan. So they have to take account of the local development plan and the national planning framework. So as Barbara says, you know, there's a lot of constraints as well. So I saw some quite good ones done before they were ordained by the Planning Act. You know, people had got on and done them anyway, because we've already got community plans up here as well, which is sort of focuses around service delivery rather than spatial planning. But they essentially, you know, you have the same kind of discussions. So there's that tension between, you know, what are you going to do with your community plan? Is it the same as the local place plan? I think you have to take account of that as well. So it's an awful lot of work for people before they even start to find out what kind of plans are around that they've got to be taken account of. But I suppose in some ways that's a good exercise for people to know. But like I said, you know, I think it's a good opportunity for communities to get together and have discussions and develop sort of connections and so on. So that, from that point of view, it's a good thing perhaps. Even if it doesn't result in something that changes things. But one point I'd quite like to make, and it's something that we've been working on in Scotland with Bob Colnut and Quentin, as well as Andy, and that's around options, because much land is now optioned. That means that developers might have an agreement with a landowner, maybe a farmer, that they will go off and find planning permission for their land if they promise that they will sell it to them if they get that planning permission. So that land is sort of like already designated in a sense for most likely housing. And these options agreements are completely untransparent. Nobody knows. You know, it's a private agreement between a developer and a landowner. So many communities are sort of unaware of this. So they might be busy drawing up their local place plans, completely unaware that an area that they might be focusing for some sort of land use is already, you know, optioned out for for housing. And so this is something we're kind of working on with the Scottish Land Commission and trying to open up the debate about, you know, getting some more transparency and a register of optioned land to enable people to actually know what land is available for what. So that's just a thought.
Thanks, Claire. Michael, you're muted. You're on mute, Mike.
I don't think I can contribute much on neighbourhood plans. There haven't been that many in London. There have been some, few. Some of my friends and colleagues and allies in Just Space have been involved in it. I think it is worth doing. It seemed to be particularly valuable, potentially, in some of those areas in London, and I'm sure there are others all over the country, where you basically got a one-party state at the municipal level, you know, where all the councillors are from the same political party, so there really is no active politics in that borough at all. And setting up a neighbourhood forum and thus doing a neighbourhood plan in, for example, in Newham, gave the people on the Carpenter's estate for a while a sort of voice, of space in which they could express demands, formulate them, show how it would work out in practice, challenge the position of the very totalitarian local government. So in that way, it could be quite valuable. I mean, they were defeated in the end, I think, because the land ownership issues defeated them. The land was all owned by the municipality, so the municipality had the last laugh. But certainly are people in London defending the potential use of neighbourhood plans as a way of getting voice in a context where nobody would otherwise listen to local concerns. But I'm really the wrong person to comment on that from a London point of view.
Andy or Victor? Andy.
I get, like Michael, I don't have a huge amount to say. I think I would echo what others have said, which is kind of broadly that, you know, every tool can be a weapon if you know how to hold it right. So, you know, there's the scope and possibility for doing things with neighbourhood plans, but it's a hell of a lot of work involved. I've got a doctoral student hopefully finishing up quite soon, Jin Lee, who's been looking at kind of the ongoing work required in the implementation and then the rewriting and reworking of neighbourhood plans. And I think, you know, I'm not sure how many groups understand that they're getting into a lifetime commitment when they start to make a neighbourhood plan, but it does seem to be a bit like that. I guess there's some things you would argue could be changed. You know, resourcing would be a big thing, wouldn't it, to provide a bit more support, but also the scope of them and the point that Michael mentioned earlier about, you know, the things that people care about don't overlap with the Town and Country Planning Act. You know, so if people could make neighbourhood plans about things they really cared about, and then it was, you know, that was used as an interface within kind of local democratic decision-making processes, that would feel a lot more powerful to me. But I mean, that's kind of sort of speculating a bit beyond the scope of what actually exists at the moment.
Can I just add another little comment on this? Yeah, can I add something?
Yes, and
for the last year or two, I've been sitting in every month on the neighbourhood planning forum meetings of a community project in Barking, which is a big development area with enormous thousands of new homes being built and new jobs created on previously derelict land previously used as power stations beside the River Thames. And this is a meeting with residents of this neighbourhood, some council tenants, some tenants of new shared ownership and open market housing, beginning to form a community and debating planning issues. The issues that come up tend to be car parking and car parking charges, service charges on top of council tax, lighting and safety at night for pedestrians and cyclists on routes, and so on. Things which absolutely don't fall within the permit of the Town and Country Planning Acts. That's fine. It doesn't prevent them discussing it. It doesn't prevent them taking enormously effective action to get solutions to these problems and press the relevant authorities. But I would say that kind of local politics is extremely valuable, whether or not it produces a plan under the Town and Country Planning Act.
I think this thing about sorry, Mike.
Yes.
Thanks. I think, yeah, this theme about the narrowness, the purposes of planning. I think what Claire was saying about getting something into the Scottish legislation about the purposes of planning is maybe one of Andy's tools that you can use as a weapon idea. But you know, what is planning for, and what comes under planning, I think is really important. Quentin, you were going to say something, I think, about neighbourhood plans.
Yes, if we just build on what's been said, really, and I think neighbourhood planning really provides us the template to envisage a truly democratic planning system, and especially if you can consider the idea that our national planning framework could be built from the bottom up, so it could be the amalgamation of a network of local neighbourhood plans, but also that neighbourhood planning, I think, partly because of all its limitations imposed on it by government, it also managed to kind of open up all the tensions in the planning system, so that there has been this amazing flurry of legal action from the real estate industry to try and close down neighbourhood plans. It, as Michael said, it spotlighted all the difficulties that planning doesn't make itself accessible to people, that it goes out of its way to demand extraordinary technical skills. So I mean, the kind of length of time needed to make a neighbourhood plan is just extraordinarily long, because not only does the work fall on a small number of individuals who obviously get tired and, you know, have other commitments in life, but that you have to master these arcane skills and this language which has very little relation to everyday life. If we want to change planning, though, it has to come from people trying it out. I think they have to take it and make it their own, and I think that's what neighbourhood planning showed us was possible. So that you know, I mean, you know this as well as I do, Sue, that some of the housing policies that came out of neighbourhood plan radically redefined what we want, what communities want from housing supply, and it was certainly the kind of opposition to this standardized, profit-driven, monopolized house building industry that we have came out very strongly from neighborhood plans. I think there's the new framework for them is trying to kind of close down the space that was opened up by them. But I think, you know, we should take them seriously and see that they have that fantastic potential to transform planning. Thank you.
Thanks, Quentin. I'm conscious of time. We've got a number of questions which are really about the planning system. So I'm going to put some of these together because I think there are some general themes. So there's a question here from Vicky, which is about the fact that planning is driven by the private industry with profit, who are allowed to donate to political party development. So can the planning system ever be democratic? And Symonds again has raised issues in relation to that and the international nature of property developers. We've also got another question from Marion, which is planning. When we talk about planning, are we actually we're actually referring to a political choice through the NPPF. That's certainly in England, which local authorities are forced to adhere to. The new planning reforms were a further nail in the coffin for local democracy. Should we vent our fury at national government rather than local planning authorities? And then we've also got another question, I think, that somebody asked about, and it goes back to the issue of planning gain, in effect, on-site, off-site planning gain, but again it's the whole kind of role of land in land capture. I'm just trying to scroll down, and I hope I'm managing to catch all these questions, but I think there's sorts of general questions that we've got there about the nature of the planning system, Can it ever be democratic? How can we make it democratic? Where should we be venting our fury, in effect? I think there's a general theme coming through those questions. So I hope I've done justice to the people who put the questions. Do put your comments further down if I haven't, and be interested to know what people think. So I'm going to start with you, Andy. I don't think we've started with you yet.
Yikes, there's a lot there, isn't there? Some great questions. I mean, I think part of my response to that would be that, I mean, can planning ever be democratic? It could be, but it would have to be democratic in a very different society, wouldn't it? And I guess democracy can mean many different things. I think I quite like Quintin's idea that we need to kind of prefigure some of the relations we'd like through our practices at the local level, kind of sort of prefigure the system we would like and the ways of relating to people we would like, and try and create that system from the ground up to some extent, is maybe one way around it. But, you know, you'd need to think about much broader things around kind of local democratic reform, but also kind of reform to national level, to things like lobbying and rules around funding of political parties and other things like that, to really think about how you counter the power of the property lobbies, I suppose. We don't know. I mean, Bob Colnutt's book is a really good read on that. We'd recommend it to people. We still don't know as much as we might about exactly what's going on there. We see glimpses of it. I think, interestingly, a few years ago, the Daily Telegraph kind of turned on the Tory party and began to leak information about their who their donors were and the kind of political influence they were demanding. And property interests were involved in a lot of those stories. I don't read the Telegraph regularly, but for a while I was trying to find when they were splashing those stories. So it's an uphill struggle because there's some very powerful interests. And ever more powerful, given what Quintin sets out in the book in terms of the growing importance of land and property and real estate interests to the wider economy, and it's that needs to be needs to be tackled, I suppose. That's a fairly vague answer, but we could probably talk about these questions for about 3 days, and no one wants to listen to me try and do that, so I'll stop there.
Okay, Rosie, would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, I was glad I didn't get asked first because there's such a lot in those questions. I'll just pick out a couple of things. So one, it's kind of sort of what does democracy mean? And maybe it's that the planning system should be meeting all needs. And as I said earlier, it's not. And I think the sort of what fills me with despair there is certainly that the Conservatives know that those in social houses don't vote Conservative. I think Labour thinks the same. So there's no votes in providing houses for those in need, it seems, which is a terrible thing to say. But I think that's how housing policy is driven. Plus, as Andy said, is kind of who is funding the various political parties. So there's that. And then specifically, I think it might have been Marianne, the question about where we should vent our fury. Should it be national or local? I have a slightly different view from sort of some of the big organisations in the planning environment on this at the moment. It probably, I think, relates to the National Development Management Policies proposal by government to make the policies at government level more sort of standardised process that councils then have to follow, rather than creating local policy at a local level. I actually think it's a really, really good idea to have much more standardisation of policy nationally. And I'll come on to why that is, but with the caveat that so long as councils can go above and beyond those base levels and do more if they want to, whether that be an environmental target or more social housing, whatever that is. And the reason I think standardisation would be brilliant is sitting through a local plan examination where the council has written all its wording for policy, then you have to go through it line by line, and then you have to cross-check whether it's compliant with the various national policies and laws and so on and so forth. And it felt like a real waste of time because most of it is standard stuff that councils need to achieve. So as a campaigner, I'd have found it a lot easier if they'd kind of started with the NPPF and said, right, we're going to try and comply with that and then adapt from it. So I know I'm a bit of an outlier on that, but I'm afraid not much trust in councils. There's so many examples of councils behaving badly in all sorts of ways. And I would rather see good top level sort of policy targets that people can then go above and beyond locally. So that's that.
Thanks very much. So, Michael?
very, very quickly. I mean, first of all, it seems to me that the various movements and campaigns that we're all involved in have got to attack at all levels, depending who they are, what they're organised around, and where they are, and the context. And sometimes one has to attack at national level, or it used to be at the European Parliament level, and perhaps it will again one day, where a lot of important decisions get made in the Commission and so on. So I don't think there's a simple answer to which level one should be attacking. It really is everywhere. I wanted to add a comment on this question of how democratic can planning be in the contemporary British system, and refer to a fascinating morning I had yesterday. I'm working on a book with somebody else on the redevelopment at King's Cross in London, and we're interviewing some of the surviving people who were involved over the period from 1985 onwards. And yesterday we spent the morning with David Pike, who was the planning officer of Camden when the first big redevelopment scheme for King's Cross and the International Railway was being proposed in the 1987-88 period. And it was very interesting to see relatively how good the public engagement was with community groups in the area in 1987 compared with anything that happens now. It was absolutely, I would say, exemplary, with very diverse community groups involved in the preparations of a 3 or 4 day event, contributing papers and documents with some funding. And then an event with lots of breakouts and workshop groups and subgroups on all sorts of things to do with the economy and housing and landscape and transport and air quality and all manner of issues, all hosted by the local authority, paid for by the local authority, recorded very fairly by the local authority and reported to everybody, which really did influence their policy and made them change their minds in important ways. So, it's inconceivable to think of that happening today. And I was really struck listening to him and looking at the documents by what a tremendous sea change there has been between, if you like, local authority best practice in the 80s and what we're seeing now. So it was just a valuable reminder that even with the constraints of the British planning system, could work a hell of a lot better than it is at the moment.
Yeah, there's to that point. Sorry, Mike. Michael. Yes, this where is that interest? Where's that funding? Where's that support coming from? And Clare, it reminds me of that Cowley Road example that we were both involved in. Clare lived down in Oxford, a big participatory planning, and which would never happen now in that way. We would never get the resources for that now, I don't think. But would you like to follow on, Clare, and make any comments?
I just guess I wanted to sort of say, as a long-term activist, I think you have to have optimism. So I'm going to try and be optimistic in this world that it's increasingly hard to be so. But I agree with Michael that we've got to. I don't mind where people target their anger and frustration, because at the moment we've got several emergencies going on. We've got the housing crisis, but we've also got some existential crisis going on with climate and biodiversity as well. So I think all hands to the, I think we need more activism and more anger, to be honest, and that where that gets directed, I'm not sure I really mind anymore. But in terms of optimism, I was quite surprised at how sort of pleased I was with the National Planning Framework up here, which did prioritise climate and biodiversity. I mean, obviously the proof is going to be in the pudding, and when we see how those policies are actually you know, seen through in planning applications and appeals. But the fact that the Scottish Government did put quite a heavy emphasis on climate and biodiversity crisis was for me a cause for optimism, and it's up to us, I think, to now push that as far as it will go. I did also think a little bit about how you can use you know, especially thinking about the Scottish context, you know, how you know, what was a local planning issue on fracking actually turned out and ended up being a national, well, Scottish wide, leading to a moratorium on fracking. So I think sometimes you might be focusing on something locally, but then it builds up to have a national impact. So maybe it doesn't matter where you attack. But we've also got some community empowerment legislation, as Quentin has suggested earlier on, up here, that is supposed to be empower communities. And when I've talked about empowerment to people before, one guy once said to me, I don't want to be empowered, I want to take power. You know, you create your own power, you're not given it, you take it. And for me, that was something that I thought was something we need to think about and do. It sounds a bit anarchic in a way if everybody grabs their bit of power, but yeah, in terms of activism, I think we need to go forward with that. You know, don't wait to be asked, if you like, proceed until apprehended. If approach would be, I think perhaps we need a little bit more of that nowadays, because indeed we are in quite a pickle.
Absolutely. Quentin, do you want to say something quick before I move on to the next question?
Yes, thanks, Sue. You just picking up on the kind of international and national question, the question about kind of where is it really? What's the source of the problem, really? And I think one of the issues I explore in the book, because there's a little bit of history, is that we've had these attempts really to take land back from an international global finance market and route it back into community planning, and most of all those attempts have been kind of thwarted very effectively by the property lobby and by kind of the timidity, I suppose, of politicians, that they didn't want to stand up to that lobby. But we need to, I think, understand that everything that has enabled a global kind of profiteering from land and from land use has been done by the state. It is legislation and tax regimes that have enabled this. It has been a deliberate action, and it follows from that a deliberate action of the state can undo all that and restore planning and to orientate around what we actually need as a society. And Claire's, you know, put a finger on kind of the huge crisis that we're actually facing. But this is also a very, very small and very local crisis, and it's about our everyday life. So, if from my perspective, there should be no market in land. Land is an inalienable resource. It cannot be sold. It cannot be given away, and there is no need for a profit-making property development industry. If we want housing, then that does not have to enable profiteering by landowners or profit making by house builders. There's no need for profit there at all. And if we want a community and a democratic planning system, then that means that land and planning powers need to be vested in a community which is organized in a democratic way. Now, I mean, I tend, because I'm, getting on in years, I tend to get a bit nostalgic about the welfare state. And if there's a fault in the book, it's perhaps there's a little bit of rose-tinted spectacles going on there. And people have to remind me that local authorities now are kind of so far from being in touch with local people that they're probably more in touch with global pension funds than they are with us. So it's perhaps silly to look for help for them, but and perhaps, you know, and there's always problems with talking about communities and what are communities and stuff like that. But taking land out of the market and taking property development out of the market, but also having some sort of proper debate about what we want and what are their priorities as a society is the bedrock for any kind of democratic planning system. And that's completely what we've lost now. I mean, when we started this this afternoon, and we were talking about the kind of vilification of the amenity movement and of campaigns that Rosie and Claire are heading up there. And you've got this complete refusal to have any discussion or any debate on equal terms about what we want as a society and what planning should be doing. That's what we need to open up, because while that is dominated by international global property interests, while that is dominated by a kind of sectarian interests, then we cannot even have that discussion. And there are everybody's got conflicting interests, but the biggest conflict really is the ability to do what you want with your property, to develop it any way you want, no matter what effect that has on everybody else. That's what planning is there to stop. It's there to protect the interests of a much wider community in the land under our feet. And one of those interests is preserving that land and preserving the biodiversity and habitat and stopping the kind of extermination of all life as we know it. So it's about taking profit and private ownership out of the planning system, and there is no real need for that, and having a debate about what the actual priorities for our society are. Oh, sounds a bit naive, doesn't it? But there you go.
Oh, I don't know about naive. It's certainly something that's been well tried, as you say in the book, Quentin. You go through the different the different phases: betterment, community land act. Somebody's put a comment in about land tax and increasing council tax, and actually, recognizing that as an important question, an issue. I'm very conscious of time. I'm just going to go to this one question, which is on a different theme. It's from a Brookes student, not a plant. And the question is about community engagement and what methodologies do the panel propose for translating the academic nature of planning to the public? Through the use of digitising community and stakeholder engagement, etc., there's a huge potential for radicalising these processes. Academic analysis, whilst necessary, can also be a form of silo thinking if not successfully inclusively translated. So I'll put that to the academics first, I think. Andy.
Thanks, Sue. So it's a really good question, isn't it? It's a difficult one in different ways. I think how to enact true democratic participatory planning. But I think we've already been talking about quite a lot of examples where it's enacted in part maybe through things like neighbourhood planning. But I think the word digitizing is sticking in my head, so I'm gonna say something a bit about that. I'm a bit skeptical. There's a big push at the moment for the digitization and standardization of planning, particularly in England, and digitalization. I see that as a potentially worrying Trojan horse alongside the standardization of national policies, for example, where we might see a very heavily standardized form of planning, where you make your choices for public participation by using some sort of fixed menu choices on a website, and it generates your plan for you in 10 minutes. And I think there's some prop tech and plan tech and kind of people with finance and interests in and around all of this at the moment. So that's not to say that there isn't potential in digital in terms of enabling people to participate. I've always thought that this is a little bit like the interface on your computer, where I don't really know how the code works for Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or Teams. Thank God I don't know how the code works for Teams, but I can navigate my way around it just about with Teams, but with Word or with PowerPoint. And there's a role there in terms of that translation. You don't need to know the code to be able to engage with it, and there's a role there for translation and translators to manage that interface and to navigate it. But a lot of those tools don't have to be digital, I think. And some of the, we talked already about how in the past, I don't think things were always much better in the past, but there's been a great deal of experimentation with different methods for engaging people. On our project, so we've been looking a little bit at Tony Gibson's work in developing planning for real, which is much more low tech and is deliberately low tech. And he said, his famous phrases around experts should be on tap but not on top. Trying to kind of make sure that those with the loudest mouths don't dominate the conversation. There's a lot of really important principles, and there's actually a lot of knowledge and skills about what works. The problem over time has been, I think, a failure to resource that properly, a failure to share that learning and to create opportunities for people to practice some of what we know does work. So that's maybe enough from me.
Rosie and then Mike.
I'll be really quick because I can see time is ticking, but I'm the opposite. I'm slightly obsessed with the need to move to much more digital engagement, and what I would love to see, because if it's digital, it can be live, it can be interrogated, it's accessible to anyone at any one time, it's interactive. I would love to see local plans on a map where you have literally all the data there at your fingertips. It might be where the site allocations are, it might be where the protected areas are, where new schools are going to be built, infrastructure provision, and I would like to see that literally updated as and when things happen. So in essence, you'd have a living plan and you'd understand what's happening to your area, and you could interrogate it rather than all the awful reams of separate documents you get at the moment in PDFs that don't tie into each other. You can't analyse properly. So I'm very obsessed with the digital planning.
Thanks. Mike.
2 points. First of all, I completely agree with what Rosie just said about the potential of all this stuff. I don't think it's going that way because, as Andy said, the people in Marsham Street in England are in league with a lot of commercial people to try and fix the whole thing, and they do pilot projects, but they're only open to local authorities, not community groups. There's no sense that citizens have any role in all this. It's all about streamlining the decision-making system in local government. That's the first comment. So I'm potentially an enthusiast, but very skeptical. Second comment is more about universities connecting with communities on all this. There are some tremendously practical things that universities need to do. The first is make their libraries available to their citizens of their surrounding towns and cities. University libraries are a fantastic resource, and community activists need access to that kind of stuff. Secondly, when we publish things, we absolutely must publish them as open access documents, not behind paywalls. Or if we have to put them behind paywalls, we need to put an alternative version somewhere in the public domain where people can get hold of it. These are two terribly simple, terribly practical, terribly important things which should be universal. Third and final comment is that I think the experience we've had through the lockdown with Zoom and so on has been that online meetings can be a tremendous liberator for some people, can enable some people to participate in public life in quite new ways, despite terrible constraints. For other people, it's been a tremendous barrier, and we've got to find ways to get the best of both worlds. End of comment.
Finally, Clare, I know in Scotland they've had a digitisation of planning has been going on for a few years, I think. I don't know if there are any thoughts, reflections from your point of view.
Not really. I haven't really noticed any improvements myself up in Scotland following that. I was going to, I'm not going to repeat anything everybody else says, but I would concur with most of it. I was going to mention actually Cowley Road Matters, which you can watch on video if you Google Cowley Road Matters, gives you some ideas for the more low-tech ways of talking to people. I think talking is always a good thing, and you understand people's perspective a lot better if you've got the chance to interact. But I'm not against digital stuff. But I did wonder whether we could also just congratulate some of the people that on the chat with doing their judicial reviews. And could I just have a quick mention about equal rights of appeal? Would that be all right? I know I'm hijacking it, but is that all right?
Quentin, is that okay with you? He's nodding his head, so yeah, I'm sure that's
I did notice there was a couple of groups that had done judicial reviews. I myself have done one, and I know how difficult it is. I found it incredibly intimidating, very expensive. It shouldn't be. We should have a right of appeal for communities, and indeed that's something that Planning Democracy have loudly been shouting for in Scotland for some time. We have just put in the complaint to the Aarhus Complaints Commission last September. We were awaiting DEFRA sending a response to our complaint. It follows a complaint that was made in Northern Ireland, where they found that not having a right of appeal means that that the Northern Ireland was in breach of the treaty that we have signed up to, the Aarhus Convention, and we're hoping to get a similar result in Scotland, and we're hoping that that's going to give us more ammunition to call for equal appeal rights for communities, at least in Scotland, and then maybe hopefully in England.
That's great. And yes, there's some great things going on in the chat. I think there's a lot of advice, a lot of information sharing, a lot of good ideas coming through, and I think you'll be capturing that as well, won't you, Quentin? So be good that people might be able to kind of access. And thanks. Yeah, just keep coming with those things. So we're at 3 o'clock now. I think, Quentin, did you want to close?
Thanks very much, Sue. Yes, that would be lovely. I really want to thank all the members of the panel. It's been fantastic. I asked the panel to do something pretty awful, which was read my book in the first place, and they've all bravely done that. And then to come and talk about it, which kind of puts them on the spot, so that they can't pretend that they have read it. So heartfelt thanks to everybody. Claire and Rosie, I hope we can carry on working together, so productively as we have in the past. Andy, Michael, it's kind of, your example that's kind of inspired me. Sue, we've worked together in the past. There are so few academics in planning who actually, have respect for communities and work with communities and are concerned about this. So we've got a fantastic alliance here, and I hope we can build on that. My kind of last comments on the kind of how do we make planning more accessible to people. I don't think it's our problem. I don't think we have to invent new kind of methods of that. I think the problem is planners. Sorry, planners, given that I teach so many of them. But there are two things going on here. One is planning is inaccessible to ordinary people because it's there it exists in an adversarial system where the property interests have very highly paid lawyers that can challenge everything. So everything has to be so carefully written to be free of loopholes. The second reason is because of planners and the planning profession created power for itself, having been created by the amenity movements that are represented in the chat and on the panel, then colonized itself and said, we're the experts and we know everything, and so we're going to write everything in a really abstruse language so that ordinary people have got no idea anymore. So this is really a bit of a power grab. The people of this country created planning because they wanted it to do something. They wanted to prioritize land for social need and environmental benefits. And having created a planning profession, that profession then said, right, I think we've got more in common with the property lobby than we have with ordinary people. So let's reverse that. Let's make planning accessible to everybody. Let's take planning back and put it back into the hands of ordinary people. So that's my sermon for today. Sorry about that, everybody. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Sue, for chairing.
And thank you again, Quentin, for doing the book and for all the discussion as well that we've had.
Thank you very much.
So
Yes,
are there any people who want to catch the recording or the chat, or will people get an email, Quentin?
Yes, the recording, Liz Schofield, who's in the background here, and with her colleague Donna Lee, who are doing all the kind of backroom work on this and made this possible. And thank you very much, Liz and Donna. They'll be sort of top and tailing the video of this recording, and that will go out to everybody who booked a place on through Eventbrite, and it will also go on the Leeds Beckett University Planning School's YouTube channel, and that should be ready in probably in about a month's time. So everybody would, Liz and Donna will also do their best to copy everything in the chat and sort of package that out to everybody, because the chat is a fantastic resource. And thank you very much, everybody who's taken part in this. Final words from you, Sue. I think if you just want to say.
Right. Well, okay. Well, thanks to everybody. Thanks for the discussion, everything in the chat, and I do recommend that you get a copy of the book. Beg, borrow, or steal. Order for your library, and hopefully it'll spark off debates like this in other places and in other audiences, and be part of building that alliance that we're talking about that's so desperately needed. So, well, bye everybody, and thanks again for coming.